And in this video, we're going to examine the question, why should we believe in Jesus Christ compared to why we should believe in anyone else? We're going to consider issues such as, who was he? What made him unique? How does he compare to leading characters of other religions? This presentation is the last of a series on deconstruction theory, in which we're considering the fundamentals of Christianity and asking, are they true or are they not true? So if you find the subject matter helpful, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to easily access previous presentations, or you could hit the bell notification to be told when the next series of videos is published. If you've got comments or questions, please let us know. So perhaps the first question we have to consider when we're thinking about Jesus Christ and whether he's worth believing in is, who was he? And the first thing to appreciate is that he was someone. This is a real historical character. This isn't a character of fiction. Jesus Christ is as historical as Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great. He's mentioned by a selection of different historians. Tacitus is perhaps one of the most competent of the Roman historians, and you can see there that he acknowledges a group who were around while he was writing called Christians, and then he explains who they were. That the founder of this name, Christ, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. But it wasn't just Tacitus. Josephus as well, a Jewish historian who had defected across to write for Roman history. He acknowledges Jesus a couple of times. In one of those occasions, he records that Ananus called a meeting of judges and brought into it the brother of Jesus, who is called Messiah, James by name, and he handed them over to be stoned. And it's not just Tacitus or Josephus. There's a selection of different historians from different backgrounds who acknowledge that Jesus was a real person. In some ways, more convincing than a lot of the historians is the approach which was taken by the Jewish leaders. For several centuries after they had been instrumental in Jesus' death, they watched with exasperation as Christianity grew and spread worldwide. Yet whilst they repeatedly accused Jesus of heresy and blasphemy and deserving to die, not once did they attempt to make the argument that he had never lived. Instead, they seemed to use the events from his life to try and prove that their opinion of him is correct. And that kind of underlines that the fact of Jesus is exactly that. It's fact, he lived and he died. If you want to know more about that aspect of Jesus, the historical side of it, then there's another presentation in this series that you might want to look for. How about the what? If we've thought a little bit about who he was, a real historical figure, what makes him worth following? What was he? A rebel leader? A religious pioneer? Political activist? Man? God? Both? Well, the historians refer to him in several different ways. They refer to him as a man, a brother, a leader, even a magician in some cases. But there's always an element of opinion with a historian, perhaps a little bit of speculation, an agenda that's being followed. If we look at what the Bible records about him, then it's very clear and consistent. Over 40 times, Jesus is called the Son of God. That's how Mary was introduced to the idea that she was going to have a son, even though that she was a virgin. And it's why Gospels like the Gospel of John were written, that we might believe that Jesus Christ is God's Son. Of course, he wasn't just God's Son. There are other ways in which he's described. So on over 80 occasions, he's described in the Gospels as the Son of Man. In other words, he was a human. Jesus himself uses that title of himself when he's teaching his disciples, when he's addressing individuals, as if he's using it to relate to those he's talking to. I know what you're going I'm going through it too, he seems to be saying. But We also know that Jesus was a practicing Jew, so he worshipped God. He attended the feasts, he went to the temple, he encouraged others to follow the law of Moses. And he followed that law so faultlessly himself that when his enemies came to try and get rid of him, they had to fabricate misdemeanors. They couldn't find anything, as far as the law of Moses was concerned, which they could use in order to do away with him. Intriguingly, of all the things Jesus is described as, one of them isn't God the Son. So the idea of the Trinity, is not actually contained in the Bible at all by name. So what else do we know about him then? Well, if he's a practicing Jew, then we know for sure that Jesus believed in just one God, because he was a member of a religious organization that's fiercely monotheistic, and he clearly accepted how important that principle was. It's in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, that we have a discussion between Jesus and a scribe recorded for us. And the scribe challenges Jesus to identify the most important principle of the law of Moses. Which commandment is the most important of all, was the question. The answer? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Now, the scribe was happy with that answer. In verse 32, "You're right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one. There is no other beside him." And had the scribe been wrong, if Jesus knew something more, or if there was something to say about the relationship which he had with his father, you would have thought that he would have said something then and not let the scribe go on his way understanding something incorrect. Jesus actually acknowledges that he displayed many of the personality traits of his father. So this Son of God, sometimes when you looked at him, it was a bit like looking at his father. In the first chapter of the Gospel of John, that idea is introduced to us. So John acknowledges nobody's ever seen God, but actually the only begotten Son, when he arrived, it was like looking at him, because Jesus was so like his father that he declared him in the things he said and the things he did. And the Jews didn't like that. So the Jewish leaders objected to Jesus claiming a close relationship with God. John chapter 5, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill Jesus, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own father, making himself equal with God. Of course, they were wrong. Jesus wasn't claiming to be equal with God. He wasn't claiming to be God. In fact, Jesus acknowledged that everything he was doing, he could only do with God's support. That's why he answers them there. "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing." So he was learning. He was being instructed by what his Father told him about the tasks that needed to be performed. Jesus, in John chapter 14, was asked, "Show us the Father," by one of his disciples. And his answer there acknowledges that they were very close. They were so close in purpose, in outlook, in message, that if you were listening to Jesus, it was as if you were listening to his Father, because they were so similar. That's why Jesus could say, "Whoever has seen me has seen the Father," not because he was the Father, but because he was so much like him. And that understanding of Jesus' relationship with his Father is very useful, because there are some things that Jesus couldn't do that he would have been able to do if he was God. For example, Jesus didn't know everything. Specifically here in Mark chapter 13, he's acknowledging that he doesn't know when he will be sent back to earth to establish his Father's kingdom. In contrast, God knows everything. The psalmist said that in the Old Testament. His understanding is beyond measure. So there are no limits to what God knows. And John paraphrases that in his first epistle. He knows everything. Well, Jesus didn't. And there are other things that we know about God which we can't apply to his son. We're told God can't be tempted. We're told God is immortal. He can't be killed. We know nobody's ever seen him. And yet, none of those things can be said of Jesus. He was tempted, just like we are, more than we are. He died and was risen again. Thousands of people saw him while he was in Israel and after his death also. Because if you're asking, is this someone that's worth taking notice of, you have to think of some of the things that he did. Here's a list, taken them from around 70 accounts in the gospel records. And when you put them all together, they are describing 35 miracles which Jesus performed. And all of those would be regarded as miracles today as well. So this is amazing stuff that was happening. And remember, this is a real person. He's living life 2,000 years ago in occupied Israel. And yet people witnessed him performing miracles which involved family occasions, incurable diseases, disabilities, hungry people, natural events. So he walked upon water. He quietened a raging storm on the Sea of Galilee. He even defied death. So 3 times during his ministry, Jesus raised people from the dead. And one of those, Lazarus, well, he'd been dead 3 days. So his family was very concerned that decomposition would already have started. And yet that wasn't a problem for Jesus. And yet his enemies never tried to deny any of these events. Well, of course, they couldn't, because everyone in Israel knew what had been happening. And it's not just a biblical record either. Josephus records that Jesus worked miracles, wonderful and mighty. And the Mishnah, which is a composition of Jewish legal opinion, that also has a reference to Jesus being able to do amazing things. It records that Jesus practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Of course, it's not just about what Jesus might have been doing. If we're deciding whether we want to follow him, it's also about, what was he saying? What was the message? Here's a selection of Jesus' teachings as recorded in the New Testament. Ask yourself if these are the sorts of qualities and behaviors that you'd like people to observe in your life. Are these the standards that you could aspire to in every aspect of life? Because the reality is that Jesus performed the miracles not just to be amazing, not just to help people, but rather he performed the miracles so that people would listen to what he had to say. The writer to the Hebrews acknowledges that. It writes of Jesus performing signs, wonders, and miracles because God was demonstrating to the people who saw them that what was happening was true, that the message was correct. This really was the Son of God who God had promised to send. Of course, that's another aspect that we should consider quickly as we're thinking about all the things Jesus was and what he did and what he said, because many of those things, the extraordinary events in his life, the events surrounding his death, they fulfilled prophecies in the Old Testament, some of which were thousands of years old. From as early as Genesis chapter 3, God started promising that he would send a son, and the details were far from predictable. This son would be born to a virgin, born in Bethlehem. People ask the question, really? Can anything good come from there? This son would work miracles. He would heal people. He would have crowds that would come to him of excited people. And yet, despite that, he would be despised and rejected. He would be betrayed by someone close to him. He would be hung out on a tree and his side would be pierced. He would suffer the death reserved for a criminal. Of course, it's been suggested that with all of that Old Testament prophecy already existing, when the records of the Gospels were compiled, it was done in such a way as to tick the boxes that the Old Testament had left waiting to be ticked. And that being the case, it's also worth looking at prophecies that Jesus made himself and that came true after he had predicted them. Here's a selection of them, which are pretty unlikely scenarios, really. Given that the person he was, claiming to be the Son of God, given the amazing things that he was doing and saying, how did he know all of these things? Of course, we know how he knew that he would be betrayed by a friend, because that was an Old Testament prophecy. So we know Jesus knew his Bible. But how did he know that one of his most loyal followers would deny that he ever knew him 3 times before the cockcrow crowed? How did he know that once he'd been killed, he would rise again on the 3rd day? How specific is that? How did he know that the temple would be taken apart stone by stone, that the Jews would be scattered so that they had no country to call their own, that his followers would be persecuted, something that started under the Emperor Nero? How did he know, just despite all of that challenge, the gospel would be preached everywhere? And yet the amazing thing is that despite the efforts of the Jewish rulers and Caesars such as Nero to discredit his memory and the accomplishments of Jesus and his followers, even so, well, he is known by millions as the figurehead of their faith today. And of course, they've never found a body. And that's unique amongst mainstream religion. Every other religious leader is dead. In some cases, their place of death has been turned into a shrine, and people trek there to mark that death. But despite people looking for the body of Jesus for thousands of years, despite all the technology that we now have at our disposal, still nobody's found a body. Not because it didn't exist. Remember the historians, remember the Jewish leaders, but never trying to explain that away. Even Islam recognizes Jesus as a real life prophet. No, the body has never been found because the tomb was empty. Of course, resurrection is unique to Christianity too. There is no other religion or religious leader who died in front of trained executors. There's no other religious leader whose body was guarded for days by soldiers for fear of what might happen. There's no other religious leader who is recorded to have risen after 3 days, been witnessed by hundreds of people, who he instructed to spread the word that his resurrection would be the first of many. And that's an amazing thing, you know, that when we're deciding whether Jesus is somebody worth following, we're not just thinking, do we believe what's happened in the past? We're also thinking about what's going to happen in the future. But for the amazing thing is that God was willing to accept one single human life lived perfectly on behalf of everyone else who has ever lived. All those who couldn't help but make mistakes, who think things they shouldn't, who say things they shouldn't, and don't say things that they should. God has offered for anyone who believes in his Son and tries to follow his example and is baptized into his name and understands what he has achieved, well, he's offered that they can be confident that ultimately God will intervene again, that he will send his Son, and that he will establish a kingdom. So the decision of whether we choose to believe and follow Jesus Christ has implications not just for the way that we live our lives now, but also for the way in which we will live our lives in the future. I hope you found this video useful. Perhaps it's raised some questions or presented a perspective that you haven't seen before. If so, please feel free to comment and ask questions, particularly if there are issues you don't think we've touched during this presentation. And remember, this presentation is one of the last of a series running under the theme Deconstruction Theory. So don't forget to hit subscribe if you want easy access to other presentations in the group. And if you've managed to get this far and watch to this point, well, thank you for your time. I hope that what we've discussed, what you've heard, has been of interest. Thank you.